Okay. Hello, class. My name is Erika Agustin, and my group partner here today is Keala Archiero. Our presentation is titled The Influence of Attachment Styles on Hoarding Disorders and Materialism in Relationships. Today, we are going to speak about its importance, factors, and methods of treatment in regards to the information provided in the title. First, I'd like to explain the purpose of this demonstration. As stated in the slide, the motivation behind our project is to evaluate how high dependence of materialism and hoarding disorders are related to John Bowlby's theory of attachment. In our presentation, we will define and explain the relevance of materialism and hoarding disorders in the United States, summarize John Bowlby's theory of attachment and its importance in relationships, identify the relationship between materialism and attachment styles, investigate the relationship between materialism and relationship satisfaction, and to provide information for possible treatment options for patients diagnosed with hoarding disorders. Since this topic is related to the theory of attachment, why were patients with hoarding disorders chosen for our project rather than those seeking couples therapy? We noticed that the majority of research studies that focus on the theory of attachment concentrated on the participants' relationships with their loved ones, friend group, and intimate partner. Thus, we decided to expand upon our research beyond the general scope of these studies, and we surveyed the statistical and analytical research on how the theory of attachment is relevant to patients diagnosed with hoarding disorders. To clarify once again, we will explain the correlation between attachment styles and relationships, materialism and attachment styles, and then finally, materialism and relationship satisfaction. Before we investigate the association between materialism relationships and relationship satisfaction rates, I will explain the relevance of materialism and hoarding disorders in the United States. According to Dr. Rana Parak from the American Psychiatric Association, around 2 to 6% of the US population has been diagnosed with a hoarding disorder. In addition, symptoms include excessively saving items, strong emotional attachment to these items, substantial distress, and problems functioning. Consequently, these symptoms may lead to difficulties in forming relationships, social and work activities, and hoarding patients most often reside in homes that are prone to fire hazards and public safety violations. Tollin and his colleagues studied why patients in US are vulnerable to hoarding disorders. According to their research, the US, as a capitalistic society, contributes to the economic and social burden of compulsive hoarding because of the people's overdependence on materialism and the endless need to compulsively buy new updated items such as technology, cars, and garments to satisfy their addicting needs. Annually, major corporate companies that have spent over millions of dollars in advertising and markets in advertising and markets nationally have contributed to these levels of consumerism. That is especially true and valuable information in understanding why hoarding is an issue to patients in the country. Hoarding is a coping mechanism in response to negative emotions and unregulated emotions in response to feelings of emptiness, loneliness, and dependency, which stated by Shota and Kalat in the textbook is the ways that people reduce negative emotions after a stressful event. As stated by researchers Tollin et al., Wheaton et al., and Wheaton et al., patients with hoarding disorders are prone to comorbidity with other types of psychological disorders such as anxiety, mood, substance abuse, and obsessive compulsive disorders. We will investigate why patients hoard as a coping mechanism and its correspondence to insecure attachment styles. To understand this relationship, we must first briefly define John Bowlby's theory of attachment and its attachment styles. According to Shota and Kalat on page 244, attachment is the lasting emotional bond between the individual and a few caregivers, producing a desire to be near that person, an impulse to turn to that person when threatened, and a sense of security and confidence in exploring new things. Thus, an infant's attachment style is based upon the parental guardian's level of intimacy, attention, and compassion towards their child. These factors vary depending on the social economic status of this family, cultural background, and direct and indirect nurture methods. As quoted by the textbook, these are the following definitions of the attachment styles. Secure attachment is a behavioral profile including exploration when the attachment figure is present, crying and protesting when the attachment figure leaves, and easy soothing when the figure returns. Anxious ambivalent attachment is a profile in which babies are hesitant to explore even when the attachment figure is present, become intensely distressed when the attachment figure leaves, and are difficult to soothe when the attachment figure returns. Avoidant attachment is a behavioral profile in which babies seem unconcerned with the caregiver's presence or absence, playing quietly and independently either way. And then finally, disorganized attachment, which is when the infant displays intense anxiety even when the caregiver is present, frightened yet, frightened yet unable to turn to the caregiver for comfort. With these definitions from the textbook in mind, we will now evaluate how secure and insecure attachment styles are reflective in materialism and relationships. Now, my group partner Keala will begin to present.
Hi, aloha class. I am Keala Arciero. I am providing an overview on anxious attachment styles, anthropomorphism, insecure attachment styles, and materialism, hoarding disorder and materialism, and treatment options. First, I want to define anthropomorphism, which is defined as applying human-like characteristics to objects or animals, but we're going to primarily focus on how people with insecure, anxious attachment style and hoarding disorder apply anthropomorphism to objects and possessions. Um, anxious, uh, anxious attachment styles, avoidant and insecure develop maladaptive behaviors. They differ than those of the secure attachment styles, as mentioned earlier. Those with a secure attachment style feel confident within their relationships. Insecure attachment styles perform attention-seeking behavior to minimize the possibility of being abandoned. When the behavior is ineffective and does not work for them, they use material objects to suffice for comfort. People who suffer from an insecure anxious attachment style and hoarding disorder, HD, have the tendency to anthropomorphize objects and possessions, and that's from Norberg et al. People with HD enjoy taking and collecting free items. People with insecure attachment style are intolerable at dealing with distress. The greater their stress or their level of distress, the higher chance of impulsivity and spending, because so they self-soothe themselves by buying, acquiring, and collecting new items. Next slide, please.
Before we continue, I would like to go back one slide because I made a mistake. I want to make one additional point before we continue on with Keala's presentation. So to understand the difference between those who grew up with secure attachment styles versus those with insecure attachment styles, we must first study how secure attachment styles correspond to healthy relationships with people and their sustainable manners of materialism. Infants who grew up with a secure attachment style are more likely to be confident in their relationships throughout adulthood. Thus, they may not have to rely upon unhealthy coping mechanisms to regulate their negative emotions. In Sun et al. Study, they found that enhanced interpersonal security has been shown to diminish the desire for money and possessions. Furthermore, they stated that there is a correlational positive relationship between attachment security and materialism. Thus, those who grew up with a secure attachment style are less prone to hoarding disorders and its consequential comorbidity disorders as they maintain less of an emphasis on materialistic objects and possessions. Now I will give this presentation back to Keala. Thank you.
Okay, I'm back. Okay, so now I am going to talk about insecure attachment styles, materialism, and hoarding disorders. So anxious avoidant attachment style, they do not desire social connections and therefore do not have the impulsivity to acquire material objects and items for comfort. People who suffer from hoarding disorder are primarily interested in collecting new items than maintaining interpersonal relationships with others. They also kind of, like I said before, add human-like characteristics to these items. It's almost like they have a relationship with these items and possessions. Regarding materialism as its own entity, according to Kosmicki and Frank, 2002, society, economy, and politics may encourage and influence spending as a way to experience the good life. Excuse me. These influences fail to address the value of interpersonal relationships. And again, that's from pages 113 through 114. So similar to what Erika mentioned earlier about how America is a capitalistic nation, and they kind of they encourage people to buy new items and, you know, acquire new things, and this is how you succeed in happiness and satisfaction. It brings a negative message, and it's definitely a negative affect to people who have HD and suffer from the insecure, anxious, ambivalent attachment style. Next slide, please. So continuing with insecure attachment styles, materialism, and hoarding disorders. So negative affect is relative to materialism and attachment inequities, which I just mentioned. Inequities in attachment, especially regarding insecure attachment styles, are associated with greater levels of attachment. So it's like they seek having an attachment or a relationship with others, and they seek that attachment, but it's almost like they don't always get that. So it's like the opposite. That's from Kosmicki, 2002, page 90. Individuals who engage in hoarding do so to acquire many possessions, and that kind of brings them comfort and security. But I also wanted to add that attachment theory claims that infants develop their sense of worth and reliability of others in times of need through their interactions with their primary caregivers. So when they don't receive that, when they can't rely on their caregivers, you know, in times of distress, it's almost like they're prone to experience distress when they go into that same situation again. And probably as adults, probably a lot of them have different triggers that cause that at times. So I wanted to add this study by Colleen Quitzlin, 2009. So she was measuring the effects of materialism and attachment styles regarding relationship satisfaction and commitment. And from the study, she revealed that materialism affects women more than men, but attachment styles affect all satisfaction and commitment for both males and females in relationships. The study also provided empirical evidence that materialism and, consumer culture negatively impact and damage relationships. So definitely someone who suffers from an insecure, anxious attachment style, and they're in a relationship, and maybe they fight with their partner a lot, perhaps to soothe that trauma or, problem. They go shopping and they go on shopping sprees, and perhaps they spend money that they really don't have, and it causes tension in the relationship. Next slide, please. Okay, so treatment options. Psychotherapy is most effective for all HD, anthropomorphism, and insecure anxious attachment disorder. Dialectical behavior therapy allows the individual to write it out and is also relative to cognitive and behavioral therapy. Acceptance and commitment therapy is the intervention of using mindfulness and acceptance techniques and different ways to commit to changing their behavior. And it was noted in the study, that's from Norberg et al., 2018, but it was noted in the study that people who have HD, they're more likely to give up on the treatment in the beginning. So it's kind of like the acceptance and commitment therapy kind of holds them accountable. Um, so according to Norberg et al., 2018, individuals with HD are recommended to try cognitive restructuring therapy, and this helps with altering their thoughts regarding human-like nature of objects. This may also help them to try to seek interpersonal relationships in replacement for collecting these objects, and also that these objects are not real, they're inanimate. According to Sun et al. 2020, ways to decrease materialism persist around setting intrinsic goals for individuals and minimizing extrinsic goals relative to materialism. Intrinsic goals increase the individual's ability to feel secure without materialistic possessions. Attachment security priming aids in building trust and cooperation and decreases materialism. So can kind of prime them to enter into these interpersonal relationships before, so they're successful and they don't turn to spending and buying lots of new things. Also, they mentioned in the study, like boosting their self-esteem kind of helps them a lot. So, I mean, that's beneficial for insecure, anxious attachment style. From the Quitzlin 2009 study, she created a MVO, which is a material values orientation genogram for couples therapy, and it uncovers hidden belief systems about money, pursuit of happiness, and self-image. And it also discusses the effects of culture consumerism. Next slide. In conclusion, hoarding disorder, anxious attachment, and materialism affects relationships. Objects and possessions provide comfort and security for those with HD and insecure, anxious attachment. Individuals with a secure attachment do not long for lots of material possessions because they are secure in their relationships. Also, I wanted to add that the possessions providing security is a maladaptive feature for HD and insecure, anxious attachment. Consumer culture and society negatively affect those with insecure, anxious attachment and HD due to the influence of buying and spending. People with HD may be more interested in acquiring and collecting free items as well, and may be a little bit more difficult to work within therapy. They're more likely to give up probably the first few times. Future studies pertaining to materialism and consumer culture may be beneficial as a causal factor for relationship strains. I think a lot of the society and advertising, it gives a negative influence to people to constantly buy new things, and that's going to provide you happiness. And I mean, it might short term, but from what we learned in psychology of emotion, that relationships are the best factor for happiness outcome. I wanted to talk about the treatment options available on Oahu. So they actually have a dialectical behavior therapy. It's located at Castle Medical Center in Kailua, even though the address says Kaneohe. There's a bunch of great therapists available on this website at Psychology Today that specialize in dialectical behavior therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, which is most beneficial for both people who have HD. I mean, I think the CBT is most effective for those who have HD, and then the DBT and CBT combined is probably effective for people who suffer from insecure, anxious attachment styles. And I believe they can set goals and work with their therapist to overcome that. And Queens Medical Center, of course, has a behavioral health unit and psychologists, and they work with you in therapy. You can do, I mean, people or individuals can do outpatient and work with a therapist and kind of set goals and maybe change their thoughts. And there's a lot of there's probably other options too, but these were the main ones. I think it's really interesting that there's a dialectical behavior therapy center. All right, well, that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I would like to show you our works cited page right here. This is part 1 and this is part 2. Thank you for listening to our presentation today, and may you guys have a good day. Bye guys.